The dirt hadn't settled on her father's grave when her uncle stepped forward and told her to sign the papers. Charlotte Hayes didn't cry. She didn't beg. She drew back her hand and slapped him across the face in front of every soul in Millstone, Wyoming. The whole town went silent. And somewhere at the edge of that crowd, a man she had never seen before watched and did not look away. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow. Charlotte all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this ranch reaches. The funeral was small. That was the first thing that told Charlotte Hayes exactly where she stood with the people of Millstone. 12 years, her father had worked that land. 12 years, he had bought his feed from Grady's supply store, his rope from Callahan's hardware, his coffee from the widow Pierce, who ran the only general goods shop on the main street. 12 years of handshakes and fair prices, and a man who never once raised his voice in a dispute he didn't deserve to win. And on the morning they put James Hayes into the ground, 9 people showed up. 9. Charlotte stood at the head of the grave and counted them. The way a woman counts the coins left in a tin after a long winter. Carefully. With full knowledge of what the number meant. The pastor, because it was his job. Old Merritt, who had worked the ranch since before Charlotte was born, who wept openly and without shame. Into a handkerchief he kept wringing between his 2 thick hands. The alderman girl, barely 16, who had once broken her wrist falling from a Hayes horse, and whom James had nursed back without charging a cent. Deputy Horace Finch, who had the decency to remove his hat. And 5 others whose names Charlotte knew, but whose faces she could not bring herself to look at directly, because she understood they had come not out of respect, but out of curiosity. They wanted to see what she would do. That was what it came down to. James Hayes was dead, and his only child was a woman, and a ranch didn't run itself, and the whole town of Millstone was watching the way a man watches a fence post that's been knocked loose in a storm with mild interest, waiting for it to finally fall. Charlotte did not fall. She stood straight in her black dress, the one she had sewn herself, because there was no money to buy a new one. And she listened to the pastor read from the book of Job, and she did not cry. She had done her crying the night before alone in the kitchen, with no witness but the last candle burning low on the table. She had given herself that one night. One night to be a daughter who had just lost her father. One night to press her face into his old work coat that still hung on the hook by the door, and breathe in the smell of hay and tobacco and honest labor. One night. Then she put the coat back on the hook, blew out the candle, and went to bed. This morning, she was the owner of Sun Valley Ranch, and owners did not collapse at their own front gate. The pastor reached the end of the passage. 2 men. Charlotte had hired for the day lifted their shovels. That was when she heard the boots. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of walk that belongs to a man who has never needed to hurry because the world has always waited for him. She knew those boots before she turned around. She had known them since she was 7 years old, standing in her father's kitchen, while the man who wore them sat at the table and smiled too wide and spoke too smooth and left her father looking tired in a way that took days to shake. Victor Hayes, her father's younger brother. The man who had built Hayes Cattle Transport into the largest livestock shipping operation between Cheyenne and Denver. The man who had offered to buy Sun Valley Ranch 4 times in the last 3 years, and 4 times been told no, and each time smiled that same wide smile and said he understood completely that family was family, that the offer would always stand. How was dressed for business, not for grief. His jacket was dark wool, his boots were clean, his silver watch chain caught the morning sun as he came to a stop at the edge of the grave. He did not look at the coffin. He looked at Charlotte. Charlotte. His voice was warm, careful, like a man reaching towards something he wasn't sure would bite. I am sorry about your father, truly. You're late, she said. A small flinch. He recovered quickly. The road from Cheyenne. The road from Cheyenne takes 4 hours. Papa died 3 days ago. She held his gaze. Victor let the silence sit for a moment, then nodded once, as though she had made a reasonable point about the weather. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. White, clean. sealed with a wax stamp she recognized as his company mark. "I don't think this is the moment," Merritt muttered from behind her. "No," Victor said pleasantly. "I don't suppose it is. But there are practical matters that won't wait for a more comfortable moment, I'm afraid." He held the envelope out to her. "The ranch is carrying a debt of $3,200 against the Millstone Savings Bank. The note comes due in 60 days. Given the current state of the drought," he glanced briefly at the dry, cracked earth around them, "and given that you'll be managing alone. Now I thought it might ease your mind to know that my offer stands. More than stands. I'm prepared to go to 4,500, which covers the debt and leaves you with capital to." "Put it away," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, put it away." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not hurt. Not even surprise. Something more like a man adjusting the setting on a piece of machinery that had not responded the way he expected. He lowered the envelope, but he did not put it back in his pocket. He held it loosely at his side. "Sell the ranch now, Charlotte," he said. The warmth was still in his voice, but there was something beneath it now, something that had been there all along and had simply stopped pretending. "Or you will lose everything before winter." The 9 people who had come to bury James Hayes went completely still. Charlotte looked at her uncle, at the envelope in his hand, at the clean boots that had not bothered to walk through mud for her father's funeral, at the silver watch chain that cost more than her family's first horse. Then she drew back her hand and slapped Victor Hayes across the face. The sound cracked out over the quiet grave like a rifle shot. Victor took one step back. His hand came up to his cheek. He stared at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not quite, but something very close to it, with a thin layer of composure stretched over the top. "You will regret that," he said quietly. "I already do," Charlotte said. "You made me do it at my father's funeral." She turned away from him. She nodded to the 2 men with shovels. They looked at each other, then began to fill the grave. Victor stood at the edge of the gathered few a moment longer. Then he folded the envelope and put it inside his jacket, smoothed the front of his coat, and walked back the way he had come. Those slow, deliberate boots, making their way across the dry Wyoming ground, without any particular hurry. Merritt came to stand beside her. "That was either very brave or very foolish," the old man said. "Probably both," she said. "Help me get home." The ranch was worse than she had let herself think about during the days of arrangements and the morning of the funeral. She had known about the debt. Her father had told her not in the way a man asks for help, but in the way a man lays his tools out on a table to take stock quietly and without drama. $3,200 owed to the Millstone Savings Bank against a loan taken out 18 months ago, when the winter had been brutal and they had lost a quarter of the herd to cold and sickness. The plan had been to rebuild the herd through spring and summer, pay the note down before it came due. Then the drought came. The grass that should have been green and thick by late May was the color of old straw and crunched under boot like dry kindling. The creek that ran the eastern border of the property had dropped by half. 3 of the remaining cattle had died in June, not from sickness, but from heat and poor grazing, and the men who had worked the ranch for years had been let go one by one because there was simply not enough work to justify the wages. Now there was Merritt, and the ranch, and 60 days. Charlotte sat at her father's desk that evening and spread every paper she could find across the surface and went through them the way she had been taught methodically without flinching, starting with what was owed and working toward what was owned. Her father had been careful with records. He had kept everything. Receipts going back 8 years. Ledgers with columns so neat they looked typeset. A man who understood that the land didn't lie to you, but the numbers could if you let them get away from you. The numbers were not good. Beyond the bank debt, there were 2 smaller outstanding obligations. Feed on credit from Grady's. Farrier work unpaid since March. Together they added another $240 to the picture. The herd stood at 31 cattle, which at current market was, she did her arithmetic twice, not enough. Not remotely enough, even if she drove them to market tomorrow, which she couldn't because she didn't have the hands to drive them. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. Her father had sat in this same chair and looked at this same ceiling more times than she could count. She used to wonder what he saw up there. Now she understood. He was doing what she was doing, going through the numbers one more time in his head, looking for a door he might have missed. She got up at midnight and went outside. The sky over Wyoming territory in midsummer was a thing that never stopped impressing itself on her, no matter how many times she had seen it, vast and black, and so full of stars that it seemed less like an absence of light than a presence of something else entirely. Something older than any of the trouble that human beings managed to invent for themselves down below. She stood on the porch and breathed the night air, which was dry and warm and smelled faintly of sage, and she thought about what 60 days looked like when broken into smaller pieces. 60 days was 2 months, 8 weeks. She could do things in 8 weeks. She did not know yet what those things were, but she would find them. The stranger came on the third morning. Charlotte was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she had the rifle off the post by the barn door before she had consciously decided to reach for it, which told her something about the state of her nerves that she did not particularly want to examine. He came in at a walk. A gray roan, solid-looking, well cared for. The man on it was lean without being thin, the kind of lean that came from years of physical work rather than scarcity. Dark brown hat, dust-covered. Dark brown vest over a plain shirt that had been washed recently, but not recently enough to erase the marks of hard travel. He wore a revolver at his left hip, which she noted and catalogued the same way she noted and catalogued everything these days. Information, all of it. He stopped about 20 feet from where she stood and raised one hand, palm out, in the manner of a man who has approached enough properties in the West to know that the gesture was the difference between a conversation and something considerably less pleasant. "Miss Hayes," he said. His voice was even, low, the kind of voice that had learned to stay calm by practice rather than by temperament. "That depends on who's asking," she said. "Name's Walker, Ethan Walker." He did not reach for anything, did not move the horse closer, just sat there with his hand still raised slightly, like a man who understood he was in another person's space and planned to stay only as long as he was permitted. "I was hoping to speak with you on a business matter." "I'm not selling." A pause. "I haven't said what the business was. This is the third morning since my father's funeral. Every man who's ridden out here since then has wanted to buy something. The alderman boy wanted to buy the creek rights. A man named Pearson wanted to buy the eastern pasture. Your kind of business tends to come in only one shape." "My kind," he repeated. Not defensive, just repeating it the way a man turns a word over to look at the underside. "Buyers," she said. "Opportunists. Men who read the obituaries and smell money." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached up slowly and removed his hat. His hair was dark and pressed flat from the hat, and he smoothed it once with his hand in the absent way of a man who had done it 1,000 times. His face was the face of a man who had spent most of his years outdoors, weathered along the jaw and around the eyes, and there was a scar at his left temple that was old enough to have settled into the skin the way old scars did. "I understand why you'd think that," he said. "And I won't pretend I don't want the land. I do. I'm looking to settle, and this property has the water access and the grazing range that makes that possible." He turned his hat once in his hands. "But I didn't come to take advantage of your situation, Miss Hayes. I came to make a fair offer that you could refuse or accept as you saw fit, that's all." "The answer is no. I heard you the first time." He put his hat back on. "I wonder if I could ask you one question before I go." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She kept the rifle at her side, not raised, but not far from it, and waited. "How much range have you got that's grazing right now?" She studied him. "Why?" "Because the drought's hitting everyone in this valley, but not equally. Some of the higher ground is holding moisture better than the flat. If you've got cattle in the wrong pasture right now, you're losing them for no reason." He settled back in the saddle. "I've been through this country before, about 12 years ago. I know where the water tends to stay." A silence passed between them that was not entirely hostile. "The north pasture," she said finally. 18 head. He nodded once. "Move them to the ridgeland east of the creek bend. There's a spring up there that doesn't show on most surveys. It runs underground most of the year and comes up about 200 yards past the old split pine. Your cattle will find it if you move them close enough." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Hayes," he said. "He was known as a fair man." He turned the horse and rode back the way he had come. Charlotte stood in the yard with the rifle at her side and watched him go, and tried to decide whether she was grateful or furious, and found she was inconveniently both. She moved the cattle the next morning. She didn't tell Merritt why. She just said she wanted to try the ridgeland and asked him to help her move 18 head before the sun got too high. The old man gave her a look that meant he had questions, but had been around long enough to know when not to ask them, and the two of them spent the better part of the morning pushing the herd up through the dry grass to the higher ground east of the creek bend. 200 yards past the old split pine, the leading cow stopped, lifted her head, and began to move east on her own. The others followed. Merritt watched the animals pick their way through the scrub brush toward a low depression in the ground where the soil was darker, and after a moment he said very quietly, "Well, don't," Charlotte said. "I wasn't going to say a thing," he said. She watched her cattle find water on a piece of ground she had walked across 100 times and never known to hold anything. Some stranger had ridden in and told her something about her own land that she had not known. She was not sure how to feel about that. She was not sure she was ready to examine how she felt about that. What she knew was that 18 cattle were drinking instead of dying. That was enough for today. In the town of Millstone, 3 days after the funeral of James Hayes, the word going around was consistent and confident. Sun Valley Ranch would be sold by the end of summer. Victor Hayes would get what he had been after for 3 years. The drought would do what the old man's stubbornness had refused to do. The woman couldn't hold it alone. No woman could. Charlotte Hayes drove her wagon into Millstone that afternoon for feed, and stood at the counter of Grady's supply store, and listened to the conversation going on in the corner between two men who had apparently not noticed she was there, or had noticed and decided not to care. And she paid for her feed and loaded it herself, and drove back out of town without a word. That evening she sat in her father's chair and opened the ledger again. Somewhere to the north, on the higher ground east of the creek bend, 18 cattle were drinking from a spring that a stranger had known was there. She picked up her pen. She began with the column on the left, which was what she owed. Then she moved to the column on the right, which was what she had. The column on the right was smaller, but it was not empty. And Charlotte Hayes had never in her life started a fight she wasn't prepared to finish. The 60 days did not wait for her to be ready. They moved the way. Debt always moved quietly, steadily, without any particular malice, simply forward one morning after another, each one costing something she hadn't planned to spend. By the end of the first week after the funeral, Charlotte had a clearer picture of exactly how bad things were, and the picture was the kind that a person looked at once and then turned face down on the desk, because looking at it a second time didn't change it, and only made the hands unsteady. 53 days. She wrote the number at the top of a fresh page in the ledger each morning. Not because she needed reminding, but because she had learned from her father that the only numbers that couldn't hurt you were the ones you were willing to look at directly. The cattle on the ridgeland were holding. That was the one thing in her favor, and she held on to it the way a woman holds on to the one good coat she owns going into winter carefully without taking it for granted, aware that it could be taken from her at any moment. Merritt had stopped asking where she had gotten the information about the spring. He was a man who had worked the land long enough to know that sometimes answers arrived from directions you hadn't been looking, and the only thing that mattered was whether the cattle were drinking. They were drinking. But 31 cattle, even healthy ones, were not going to pay $3,200 in 53 days. She needed hands. She needed them to move the herd to market, and she needed them to do the work that she and Merritt could not do. Alone, the fence repairs that had been waiting since spring, the barn roof that had a section threatening to come down in the next serious wind, the water troughs that needed replacing before the summer heat got worse. She rode into Millstone on a Tuesday morning with a list in her coat pocket and enough money to hire 2 men for 30 days, which was not enough money and not enough men, but was what she had. She stopped at the feed store first. Grady was behind the counter, A short man with a red face and small eyes that moved quickly over everything, cataloging and calculating in a way that Charlotte had always found vaguely unpleasant. "Miss Hayes." He said it the way people said it now, with that particular careful neutrality that was its own kind of statement. "I need a 50-pound sack of oats and another of the mixed grain," she said. "And I'd like to settle the outstanding balance today." She put the money on the counter. "What does it come to?" He looked at the money, then at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read immediately, and then could. He had not expected her to pay. He had expected her to ask for more credit. $112, he said. She had brought 140. She counted out the amount, pushed it across, and picked up her list. "And I'm looking to hire 2 working hands. Fair wages, 30 days guaranteed. Do you know anyone looking for work?" Grady began writing out her receipt with the slow deliberateness of a man who was choosing his words the same way. "Things are tight all over," he said. "Most men who were looking got taken on by Hayes Transport last week. Mr. Victor Hayes was hiring for his new stockyard operation." Charlotte kept her face still. "Victor is building a stockyard, about 4 miles east of town, on the old Brennan property." Grady looked up from the receipt. "He bought it in the spring. Said he's going to run a full transport route through this valley by fall. 4 miles east of town was exactly where the main grazing corridor ran. The route that every rancher in the valley used to move cattle toward the rail connection in Cheyenne." She understood what she was being told, not by Grady directly, who was being careful, but by the information itself, which was not careful at all. Victor wasn't just trying to buy her land. He was building something that would make her land worthless if she kept it. She took the receipt. She picked up her list. She walked out of Grady's store and stood in the street and breathed twice steadily, and then she walked to the next place on her list. The first 2 men she approached about work said no before she finished asking. The third one, a young man named Cass Heller, who she knew slightly from church, looked genuinely uncomfortable and said he was sorry. Miss Hayes, he truly was, but his wife had just had a baby, and he couldn't afford to be on the wrong side of a dispute that seemed like it was going to get worse before it got better. She stopped in the middle of the boardwalk. "The wrong side," she said. Heller had the decency to look ashamed of himself. "I just mean Victor Hayes is a powerful man in this valley, Miss Hayes, and people—" He stopped. "People what?" He looked at his boots. "People are saying it might be kinder to let you know that fighting him isn't going to end well. That your father was a good man, but the ranch was already in trouble before he passed, and that maybe the best thing, Charlotte said, would be for you to finish that sentence very carefully." He didn't finish it. She walked back to her wagon. She loaded the feed herself. She drove home. By the time she got back to the ranch, she had composed herself back into the version of Charlotte Hayes that was useful, the one that kept the ledger made. The decisions did not waste energy on things she could not change. The version that her father had spent 20 years quietly building in her, without either of them fully realizing it was happening. Merritt was waiting by the barn, with an expression that meant something had happened while she was gone. "What?" she said before she was off the wagon. "Found a section of east fence cut," he said. "Clean cuts. Somebody came out here in the night with wire cutters and went through 40 feet of line." Charlotte stepped down. "The cattle?" "Still on the ridge. I counted them all." He paused. "But the fence separates your north boundary from the Draper property. If they'd gotten through and mixed with Draper's herd—" "They didn't." "No, but somebody wanted them to." He looked at her steadily. This wasn't a random thing, Charlotte. She had known that before he finished the sentence. She stood there for a moment in the full weight of what she was understanding. Not just the debt, not just the drought, not just the market and the stockyard, and the men who wouldn't hire on with her. All of it together. All of it at once. A campaign, patient and deliberate and wearing the face of business while it dismantled her from every direction simultaneously. "Fix the fence," she said. "Already done." "Good." She looked toward the ridge. "And don't leave the property tonight." That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and ran through the numbers again, the way she had been running them every night, looking for the door she was missing, And at some point past midnight she stopped running numbers and started thinking about Ethan Walker. She didn't want to think about him. There was nothing useful in thinking about a man who had ridden onto her property and offered to buy it, and then given her information about her own land that had proved accurate enough to keep 18 cattle alive. The two facts sat uncomfortably beside each other and refused to resolve into anything clean. He knew her land better than she did. A man who wanted to buy her land, knowing things about it that she didn't know, that was not a coincidence she was prepared to be comfortable with. In the morning she rode to town to file a complaint with the sheriff about the cut fence. Sheriff Alderman was a large, slow-moving man, with the disposition of a person who had been sheriff long enough to be tired of most of what the job required. He listened to her with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes moving between her face and the window, the way a man's eyes move when he is already composing his response while you are still talking. "Wire can come loose in dry conditions," he said when she finished. "Ground contracts posts shift." "These were cut," Charlotte said. "Clean diagonal cuts on both sides. Merritt has been fixing fence on this land for 30 years. He knows the difference." "Merritt's eyes aren't what they used to be," the sheriff said, not unkindly. "My eyes are fine," Charlotte said. "I looked at the fence myself." A pause. Alderman unfolded his hands and refolded them. "Miss Hayes, I understand you're under considerable strain right now, and I have a great deal of sympathy for your situation. But without witnesses, without evidence of who?" "Without evidence," she repeated. "Someone cut 40 feet of my boundary fence in the night, and without a signed confession, you can't help me." "That's not what I said." "That's what you meant." She stood up. "If any of my cattle go missing, I expect you to take that more seriously." She walked out of the sheriff's office and stood in the street and understood fully and finally that Millstone was not going to help her. The town had made its calculation. Victor Hayes ran the largest employer in the valley. Victor Hayes was building a new stockyard that would bring money and work and commerce. Victor Hayes had offered to buy Sun Valley Ranch at a fair price, and his stubborn niece had slapped him at her father's funeral and now seemed determined to go down fighting rather than take the sensible way out. The town had chosen. She was standing on the losing side alone. She was crossing the street toward where her horse was tied when she saw him. Ethan Walker was standing outside the hardware store, talking to a man she didn't recognize. And something in the angle of the conversation, the way Walker's head was slightly lowered, the way the other man seemed to be delivering rather than receiving, made the back of her neck go cold. She stopped. Walker said something. The other man nodded. Then the other man walked away, and Walker turned and found her eyes across the street, without any apparent surprise, as though he had known she was there. She crossed to him. "Who was that?" she said. "Morning, Miss Hayes." "Who was that man?" Walker looked at her with the same measured steadiness he had shown at the ranch. Unhurried, the look of a man who had decided in advance how much of himself he was going to show, and was not going to be pushed past that line by urgency. "A man I know from Cheyenne," he said. "Business acquaintance." "What business?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of something that might have become one under different circumstances. "You came here to ask me that." "I came here to file a complaint with the sheriff. Seeing you was coincidence." She held his gaze. "Somebody cut my fence 3 nights ago, 40 feet of east boundary line." His face changed. Genuinely not performed. The thing that moved across it was not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has received information that connects to something else he already knew. She caught it and held it like a woman catches a detail in a ledger column, a number that didn't match small but significant. "Was anything taken?" he said. "Not this time." He was quiet for a moment. "You have 31 head on the ridgeland, 29 now. I sold 2 last week for working capital." The admission cost her something. She made herself say it evenly. "Whatever your interest is in my ranch, Mr. Walker, I'd appreciate you being direct about it. I'm too busy to manage people who aren't." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as a genuine question, not an offer." "Ask." "How long do you think you can hold it?" It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. She felt the honesty of it, like a cold hand on the back of her neck. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She picked up her horse's reins. Good day, Mr. Walker. She rode 3 blocks before her hands stopped shaking. The letter from the Millstone Savings Bank arrived on a Friday. She had been expecting it in the sense that a person expects a bad winter when the signs have all been there since September. Not surprised, but not ready either, because readiness was a luxury. The situation was not permitting her. The letter was from the bank manager, a man named Hargrove, and it was written in the language of institutions, which was the language of inevitability, dressed in the clothing of regret. Due to the current state of market conditions in the valley and the outstanding balance of the note in question, the bank was requesting a meeting to discuss the terms of the obligation and the possible necessity of accelerated repayment. The word accelerated was underlined. Hargrove had done it himself in pen, which meant he wanted her to know it had not been a clerical decision. She read it twice. She put it on the desk face down. Then she picked it up again and read it a third time, because her father had taught her that the first reading told you what the words said, and the third reading told you what they meant. What they meant was, we are being pressured. She thought about Victor and his stockyard, and his clean boots, and his patience that looked like kindness, but was actually just a longer version of what he had been doing all along. A campaign. Systematic. She thought about the sheriff's folded hands. The men who wouldn't hire on. Grady's careful neutrality. The fence cut in the night. She had 49 days. And Victor Hayes was not waiting for the 60 days to run out. He was shortening the runway. She was in the barn the following morning, working on the roof section that had been threatening to come in, hammering boards alone, because there was no one else to do it, when she heard a horse in the yard and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach the way it did now every time she heard hoofbeats, the instinctive brace for the next thing. She came down the ladder. It was Ethan Walker. I was not alone. There was a young man with him, perhaps 19, with a broad, honest face, and the look of someone who had spent his whole life outdoors and was comfortable with it. A bay horse trailed behind them carrying tools in the saddlebags. Real tools, not traveling tools. A post hole digger. A coil of fencing wire. Charlotte looked at the tools. She looked at Walker. I didn't ask for help, she said. No. He agreed. You didn't. Then why are you here? He dismounted. The young man stayed on his horse, watching with cautious, respectful attention. Because you've got a barn roof coming down and a fence line that somebody already knows how to find in the dark, Walker said. And because I've been in this country long enough to know that a woman running a ranch alone in a drought with a man like Victor Hayes on one side and a banknote on the other doesn't have the luxury of pride. The word pride hit her somewhere specific, and she felt the flash of anger that was her first response to anything that got too close. I have pride for a reason, she said. I know. He held her gaze. So do I. I'm not here to take anything from you, Miss Hayes. I'm here because... He stopped, looked at the barn, looked back. Because it's the right thing, and I don't have anything better to do with my time. And because those cattle on the ridge need that fence solid, or the next person who comes with wire cutters won't stop at 40 feet. The young man on the horse said, I'm Daniel. I work with Ethan. I'm good with wire. Charlotte looked at Daniel. She looked at the coil of fence wire on the saddle. She thought about 49 days and a banknote with the word accelerated underlined and 29 cattle on a ridge that a stranger had told her about. The east fence runs about 300 yards from the creek bend, she said. There's soft ground in 2 places that's going to need new posts. The old ones are rotting out. We'll take care of it, Walker said. She looked at him for another moment, this lean, careful, unreadable man with the old scar at his temple and the slow, deliberate voice, and she was aware that she was making a decision that could not be unmade once it was made. I'll pay you for the labor, she said. I'm not asking for pay. I know you're not. I'm telling you I'll pay anyway because I don't take charity and I don't carry debts I can't name. She held his gaze. The day I can't look you in the eye and tell you exactly what I owe you is the day I've lost something more important than the ranch. He was quiet for a long moment. 50 cents a day for the wire work, he said. For Daniel and me both. $1.20 between you, fair wage. Fair wage, he agreed. She turned back toward the barn. Roof goes first. The fence won't matter if the cattle have nowhere dry to shelter. She was halfway up the ladder before she let herself think about what she had just done. She had let someone in. Not all the way, not even close to all the way, but through the first door. And the first door in her experience was always the one that mattered. Above her. The sun hammered down on the dry Wyoming land, and somewhere to the east, Victor Hayes was building his stockyard, and the bank was drafting its next letter, and the 60 days were becoming 49, and then 48, steady and relentless, the way time moved when you were afraid of it. She drove the next nail in. They worked through the worst of the midday heat without stopping. Charlotte had long ago stopped being surprised by her own capacity for physical work. Her father had never made distinctions about which tasks were suited for which kind of person, and she had grown up knowing how to use a hammer and a saw and a post hole digger the same way she knew how to keep a ledger and read a land survey. But working alongside someone else after months of it being only her and the aging Merritt was strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. The barn roof got done in 4 hours. By afternoon, Walker and Daniel were running new fence wire along the east boundary, and Charlotte was keeping pace digging the soft ground post holes herself, while Walker set the posts and Daniel ran the line. They didn't talk much. That was the thing she noticed, and filed away without examining too closely. There was a quality to the silence that was not uncomfortable. Walker worked efficiently without waste motion, without the kind of deliberate helpfulness that was actually a form of performance. He didn't explain what he was doing or look to see if she was watching. He just did the work. She found that she respected it more than she wanted to. At dusk, with the fence line solid and the barn roof sound, Charlotte made coffee on the stove and poured 3 cups and set them on the porch railing, and didn't make an invitation of it, just left the cups there. Walker came up and took one and leaned against the porch post. Daniel took the second and found a spot on the steps. "Hargrove sent me a letter," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because she was tired and the coffee was hot, and there was something about the particular quality of that silence that made speaking into it feel less dangerous than it normally did. Walker looked at her. "He wants a meeting," she said, "to discuss accelerated repayment." "Hargrove's had the same account at that bank for 20 years, Walker said after a moment. "He doesn't accelerate notes on his own judgment." "No," she said, "he doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. "I need to know something," Charlotte said. She turned to look at him directly. "And I need you to answer me straight, because I can work with a lot of things, but I can't work with someone who isn't straight with me." He met her eyes. "Ask." "Do you know Victor Hayes?" Something passed over his face that she watched carefully. The particular quality of a man who has been asked a question. He was waiting to be asked, and has already decided how to answer it, and is now in the moment of delivering that answer. "I've met him," he said. "That's not what I asked." A pause, longer than the ones before it. Outside, the night insects were starting up in the dry grass, that steady mechanical sound that was the heartbeat of Wyoming summers. "I did some work for his company," Walker said. "About 8 years ago, scouting work, riding ahead of cattle drives to identify water sources and safe routes." Charlotte set down her coffee cup very carefully. "You worked for Victor Hayes," she said. 8 years ago, for about 4 months. Then I stopped." "Why?" He looked out into the dark. "Because I figured out what the scouting work was actually for. It wasn't to find better routes for the cattle." He paused. "It was to identify which properties had the best water access. Which ranches were sitting on land that would be worth considerably more if someone with capital and patience decided to acquire it over time." Charlotte was very still. "He was mapping the valley," she said. "He was mapping the valley." She thought about the spring on her ridgeland, the spring that Ethan Walker had known about, the spring that didn't show on most surveys. She thought about a man who had spent 4 months riding this land for Victor Hayes 8 years ago. She stood up. "Get off my property," she said. The words came out flat and certain, the way the most important words always did with her, not loud, not sharp, just direct and absolute as a deed recorded in a courthouse. Walker didn't move immediately. He looked at her with an expression that she might have called pain if she'd been willing to look at it long enough to name it, which she was not. "Charlotte." "Miss Hayes," she said. He put down his cup. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he stepped off the porch and walked to his horse and mounted without another word. Daniel scrambled after him, throwing a single wide-eyed look back at the porch, and then they were riding out into the dark, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and the night insects filled back in, around the silence, as though the silence had never been broken. Charlotte stood on the porch of her father's house and looked at the dark. She had let someone through the first door, and the first door in her experience was always the one that mattered. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and went through it the way she went through the ledger columns methodically, without flinching, starting from the first fact and working forward. Ethan Walker had worked for Victor Hayes. He had spent 4 months riding this valley, mapping water sources, identifying which properties were worth acquiring. He had known about the spring on her ridgeland before he ever rode onto her property. He had told her about it, and then he had shown up with tools and a young man named Daniel and worked a full day on her barn and her fence line for $1.20 between them. She turned that over and over in the dark. A man working for Victor Hayes did not fix the fence that Victor Hayes's people had cut. A man working for Victor Hayes did not tell the woman Victor was trying to dispossess where the hidden water was on her own land. Those two things did not fit the same shape, unless he wasn't working for Victor anymore. Unless 8 years was a long time, and people changed, and the reason he had stopped after 4 months was the reason he had said that he had figured out what the work was actually for and had not wanted to be part of it. She thought about the way his face had looked when she told him to get off her property. She pushed the thought away. It didn't matter how his face had looked. What mattered was the ranch and the 48 days and the banknote with the word accelerated underlined by Hargrove's own hand. What mattered was Victor Hayes building a stockyard 4 miles east of town and buying the loyalty of the valley one hired hand at a time. What mattered was that she was alone on this property with an old man and 29 cattle and a barn roof that was now sound and a fence line that was now solid. And those last 2 facts had been accomplished by the hands of a man she had just sent away. She got up at 4 in the morning and made coffee and sat at her father's desk and opened the ledger. By the time the sun came up, she had a plan. It was not a good plan in the sense that a good plan was one with high odds of success. It was a good plan in the sense that it was the only one available, and it was honest about what it required. She needed to get her cattle to market before the banknote came due. To do that, she needed hands for a drive. To hire hands, she needed money she didn't have. To get money, she needed to sell something that wasn't the ranch. She looked around the room. Her father's silver pocket watch sat on the corner of the desk where it had sat every day of her life since she was old enough to remember objects. She picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. Not yet. She went to the barn and saddled her horse and rode to town before the heat got up. The meeting with Hargrove was at 10 o'clock, and she arrived at 9:55, which was how her father had taught her to arrive at any meeting where the other person held the advantage early enough to choose your seat late enough not to seem anxious. The bank was cool, inside the way. Stone building stayed cool in the morning before the day caught up. Hargrove came out to meet her himself, rather than having his clerk do it, which she noted and filed. He was a thin man with a thin mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent his career reading people across desks and had gotten good at keeping his own face from being read in return. "Miss Hayes." He gestured toward his office. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her and folded his hands and began with the language of regret, which she listened to for approximately 30 seconds before she said, "Mr. Hargrove, what is the actual situation?" He stopped, recalibrated. "The bank is under pressure to resolve outstanding notes that present elevated risk," he said. "Your note is one of them." "Pressure from whom?" A pause. The careful eyes moved once and came back. "Institutional review," he said. "Market conditions." "Victor Hayes holds a significant deposit account at this bank," she said. "Possibly several. His transport company runs its operating accounts through here. That kind of depositor relationship gives a man influence over institutional decisions." She held his gaze. Am I wrong? Hargrove did not answer. But he did not deny it, and a man who was going to deny something denied it immediately. I need 30 days, she said. I have 29 cattle on good grazing. I need 30 days to organize a drive to Cheyenne and get market price. At current rates that covers the note and the arrears. Miss Hayes, I'm asking for 30 days. I am offering you a written commitment signed today that if I do not deliver full payment within 30 days, I will accept a foreclosure proceeding without contest. She let that land. That gives the bank certainty. That gives me a fair chance. If Victor Hayes is the reason for this pressure, then he gets nothing by you refusing me, except the satisfaction of having used your institution to do something that isn't your decision to make. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. 20 days, he said. She wanted to argue. She looked at him and understood that 20 days was not a negotiating position. It was the actual limit of what he could hold against the pressure he was under. 20 days, she said. She signed the paper. She walked out into the morning heat and stood in the street and did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. 20 days was not enough time to organize a cattle drive from Sun Valley to Cheyenne under normal conditions. With no hands and a depleted herd in drought conditions, it bordered on the impossible. She was halfway to where her horse was tied when she heard Daniel's voice behind her. Miss Hayes, she turned. The boy was standing near the alley beside the hardware store, hat in his hands, looking like someone who had been waiting and wasn't sure how it was going to go. He didn't send me, Daniel said immediately. I came on my own. I want you to know that. What do you want, Daniel? He took a breath. Ethan told me what happened, about working for Victor Hayes before. He turned his hat once in his hands. He told me the whole thing last night after we left. He told me why he stopped. He told me what he's been doing since. He paused. I think you should hear it from him. I know that ain't my place to say, but I've ridden with Ethan Walker for 2 years, and I know what kind of man he is, and I think... He stopped himself. I think you're about to try to run 29 cattle to Cheyenne in 20 days, and you're going to need more than you've got. Charlotte looked at the boy. He was earnest in the specific way of young men who had not yet learned to be cynical about honesty, and she found that she could not dismiss him the way she could dismiss older men who had. Where is he? She said. South edge of town. There's a rooming house by the livery. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, Tell him I'll be there in 1 hour. Walker answered the door before she knocked. He had heard the boots on the stairs. Probably he was that kind of man. He stepped back to let her in, and she came in and stood in the center of the room, and he stood near the window, and neither of them sat down. Daniel said you had something to tell me, she said. I do. He didn't hedge. She was beginning to understand that about him, whatever else he was, he did not hedge. After I left Victor's employ, I spent 2 years with the Pinkerton Agency out of Denver. Not as an operative, as a contractor. They were investigating Hayes Transport for land fraud, using false surveys to devalue properties, bribing county officials to misrecord deed transfers, pressuring banks to call in notes on targeted ranches. Charlotte was very still. Your father's ranch was on a list, Walker said. A list of properties that Hayes Transport identified 8 years ago as acquisition targets for the Valley Corridor. Sun Valley was near the top of that list. He looked at her directly. That's why I came here. Not to buy the land. To find out how far Victor had gotten with the acquisition scheme. Whether the fraud was still active and documented enough to take to a federal court. The room was quiet. You're investigating my uncle, she said. I was. My contract with the Pinkertons ended in March. But what I found before it ended... He crossed to the small table by the bed and picked up a leather satchel she hadn't noticed when she came in. He opened it and took out a document. Set it on the table between them. Survey records, filed with the Wyoming Territory Land Office in 1881, showing that a portion of Sun Valley Ranch, specifically the 40 acres containing the Ridge Spring and the creek access, was transferred to a subsidiary company of Hayes Transport. A company your father almost certainly didn't know existed. She picked up the document. Her father's name was on it. His signature was on it. She read it twice. Then she looked up. My father never signed this, she said. "This is not his signature." "I know," Walker said. "It's a forgery, a good one. But there are inconsistencies in the notarization date that a lawyer who knows what to look for can identify." She looked at the document again. The land described in it, the ridge spring, the creek access, was the heart of the ranch's water supply. Without those 40 acres, the remaining property was worth a fraction of its current value. Without those 40 acres, even if she paid the banknote, she was operating on land that someone else legally owned, according to a fraudulent record filed 3 years ago. Victor hadn't been waiting for her to fail. He had already taken half the ground from under her feet, and she hadn't known it. She sat down. She didn't plan to. Her legs simply decided that standing was no longer the appropriate response to what she was holding in her hands. "How long have you known this?" she said. "I've had the document for 6 weeks, he said. "I came here to verify it against the original county records before bringing it forward. I didn't know your father had died until I arrived. I didn't know the banknote was in default. I didn't know—" He paused. "I didn't know how far along the rest of it was." 6 weeks. He had been sitting on this for 6 weeks. "You should have told me," she said. "The day you rode onto my property, you should have told me." "Yes," he said, without qualification, without defense. "I should have." The honesty of it hit her harder than an argument would have. She had been ready for an argument. She looked down at the document in her hands. Her father's forged signature. His name written by someone else's hand, transferring away the water that made his land viable, and he had lived the last 3 years of his life, not knowing that on paper he had already given it up. She thought about him at this desk in the evenings, running the numbers and looking at the ceiling, looking for the door he was missing, not knowing the door had been removed from the outside. Something moved through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, and was in fact both things at once, occupying the same space the way 2 weather systems could collide over open country. "What happens with the document now?" she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady. "There's a federal land office in Cheyenne," Walker said. "If you file a challenge to the recorded transfer with supporting evidence of forgery, the record gets suspended pending investigation. Victor can't act on the fraudulent deed while the challenge is active." "How long does that take?" "Filing takes 1 day. The suspension is automatic. The investigation takes months. But the suspension is what matters right now. It blocks any legal action on the basis of that record." 1 day. She needed to get to Cheyenne. She was already doing the arithmetic, not the cattle drive arithmetic, but the other arithmetic, the travel arithmetic, the 20 days remaining minus 1 day, to Cheyenne minus 1 day back, and what was left to move 29 cattle to market. "I need to be in Cheyenne by end of week," she said. "I know. And I need to move the herd before I go. I can't leave them unattended for 2 days with nobody here but Merritt." "Daniel can stay with Merritt," Walker said. "I can ride with you to Cheyenne." She looked at him. "And the cattle drive," she said. "After Cheyenne. 20 days from today is—" "Tight," he said. "But not impossible. If we start the drive the day after we get back." She thought about it. She thought about what it meant to accept his help when she now knew the full history. Victor Hayes, the Pinkertons, 6 weeks of known information he had not shared. She thought about the fence he had repaired, and the cattle that were drinking from the spring he had told her about, and the barn roof that no longer threatened to come down on her animals. She thought about the forged signature on the document in her hands. She thought about 20 days. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Why what? Why does this matter to you? You said your contract with the Pinkertons ended in March. You're not being paid to do this, so why?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not evasion, but the genuine working through of how to say something honestly. "Because I helped map this valley for a man who used that information to steal from people like your father," he said. "I stopped when I figured out what it was, but I had already done 4 months of it. The spring I told you about, I found that spring writing for Victor Hayes." He held her gaze. "I owe something to this valley. Maybe I can't pay it all back, but I can start with what's right in front of me." The room was quiet for a long time. Charlotte folded the document and put it in her coat. She stood up. We leave at first light Thursday. Thursday, she said. Cheyenne and back in 2 days. Drive starts Saturday. She moved toward the door. Daniel stays with Merritt. You ride with me. She put her hand on the doorframe and stopped without turning around. And Walker, if there's anything else you haven't told me anything at all, you tell me now. Because I can work with hard information. I cannot work with surprises. He said, there's one more thing. She turned. The man I was talking to in the street yesterday, he said. The one from Cheyenne. He paused. He was a courier. Victor Hayes hired a lawyer in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago. A land lawyer. The kind that specializes in disputed property claims. He let her understand what that meant before he continued. Victor knows about the fraudulent record. He's not waiting for the drought or the banknote anymore. He's going to file a legal claim to those 40 acres before your 20 days are up. The floor seemed to shift slightly under her feet. She held the doorframe. Victor was going to use his own forged document to file a legal claim. He was going to walk into a courthouse and say, this land is mine, and he was going to do it within 20 days, which meant he was going to do it before she could file her challenge, which meant, how much time do we actually have? She said. Walker said, 10 days, maybe 12. She stood in the doorframe and breathed once, twice. Thursday is too late, she said. Yes. We leave tomorrow. I'll be ready. She walked out into the hallway and down the stairs and into the heat of the millstone afternoon, and she moved at a pace that was not quite running, but was the pace of a woman who understood that the ground was shifting faster than she had known, and that the only direction available was forward. She was back at the ranch by mid-afternoon, and she told Merritt everything. Not in pieces, not managed everything, straight through the forged document, and the land lawyer in Cheyenne, and the 10 days, and Walker, and the Pinkertons, and all of it. The old man listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything that mattered, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your father knew something was wrong, Merritt said. She looked at him. Last winter, he went through the land records himself. I saw him with them spread out on that desk 3 nights in a row. He never found what he was looking for, but he knew something was off. Merritt looked at his hands. He said to me once he said something doesn't add up with Victor, and I can't put my finger on it. I told him he was tired and worried and seeing shadows. He paused. I shouldn't have told him that. Charlotte put her hand on the old man's arm for a moment. You didn't know, she said. No, he said. But he did. He just didn't have the piece that made it make sense. She thought about her father at the desk in the evenings, looking at the ceiling, looking for the door he was missing. She thought about him finding the records and knowing something was wrong and not being able to name it and then dying without ever getting to name it. She was going to name it for him. She went to the desk and pulled out the ledger and began writing a list of everything she needed to take to Cheyenne, the document. The original survey records her father had kept the deed of ownership. The bank correspondence, a letter she was going to write tonight to the Federal Land Office explaining the nature of the challenge. She wrote until the candle burned low. When she finally put down the pen, she sat for a moment in the quiet house, and she thought about the fact that Ethan Walker had known the truth about this land for 6 weeks and had not told her immediately, and the fact that he had fixed her fence and her barn roof and told her about the spring and had stood in a rented room in Millstone and said yes to everything she asked of him without qualifying it. She thought about the two things sitting side by side and refusing to resolve into anything simple. She picked up the candle and went to bed. Tomorrow, she would ride toward the thing that was trying to take everything her father had built. She would ride toward it directly the way he had taught her, and she would not look away from it, and she would not let it win. That was the only plan there was. That was enough. They rode out before sunrise. Charlotte had the documents in a leather case her father had used for land records, oilskin wrapped, tied twice, tucked inside her coat, where she could feel it against her ribs with every stride of the horse. She had not slept more than 2 hours. She knew it and accepted it, the way she accepted most things she couldn't change, without complaint, without drama, simply as a condition of the current situation that had to be worked around rather than through. Walker was at the gate when she came out of the house. He had his horse saddled and a second canteen tied to the saddlebags, and he handed her a piece of wrapped cornbread without comment, which she ate in the saddle as they moved out through the gate and turned south toward the Cheyenne Road. They rode in silence for the first hour. Not uncomfortable silence, the same quality she had noticed before, the kind that belonged to two people who were both inside their own thinking and did not feel the need to perform otherwise. The road was dry, and the horses moved well in the cool pre-dawn air, and Charlotte kept the leather case pressed against her ribs and thought about the list of things she needed to say to the land office clerk. "You've done this before," she said, not a question. Walker looked over at her. "Filed a land challenge. Walked into a government office and made someone uncomfortable with evidence they would rather not look at." A pause. "A few times." "Did it work?" "Twice out of 3, he said. The third time the official was too deep in the other man's pocket to move. We had to go over his head." "And if that happens today, then we go over his head," he said. "The Federal Land Commissioner's office is 2 blocks from the Territorial Land Office. If the clerk won't suspend the record, we walk 2 blocks and file a fraud complaint directly with the federal office. That triggers a different process that the clerk can't block." She thought about that. "You've already mapped the route." "I tend to plan for the door being locked," he said. She looked at him for a moment. This man who planned for locked doors, who had been sitting on a forged document for 6 weeks, who had fixed her fence and told her about her own spring, and was now riding toward Cheyenne in the dark beside her, because he said he owed something to this valley. She turned back to the road. "Tell me about the woman," she said. He didn't answer immediately. She felt the pause the way you feel a change in the air before weather arrives. "What woman?" he said. "The one you lost. You mentioned it the reason you left the sheriff's work. A woman, a train robbery." Another pause. Longer. She waited. "Her name was Anna," he said. "We were going to be married in the spring. She was traveling to meet my family in Laramie. The train she was on was held up outside of Rollins." He was quiet for a moment. 3 people were killed. She was one of them. Charlotte said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't diminishing. The men who did it were working for a cattle baron who wanted to stop a land reform bill from reaching the territorial legislature, Walker said. The robbery was a distraction. They were after a state senator on the same train. He paused. The senator lived. Anna didn't. Did they catch the men? Eventually. It took 2 years. His voice was even. It was the evenness of someone who had worked very hard to make it even, and had been working at it long enough that it mostly held. After that, I didn't have much interest in carrying a badge anymore. The system that was supposed to prevent what happened to her was the same system the cattle baron had been using to protect himself for a decade. "So you went to work for Victor Hayes," Charlotte said. "So I went to work for Victor Hayes," he agreed. "Because it paid, and because it didn't require me to believe in anything. That was what I wanted at the time, to not believe in anything." She thought about that, about what a person looked like on the inside when they had stopped believing in anything and were just moving forward because stopping was worse. She thought she recognized something in that description that she was not yet ready to examine too closely. "And then you figured out what the work was," she said. "And then I figured out what the work was, and I found I still believed in something after all. It just took watching someone else's wrong to remind me what it was." The sun was coming up ahead of them, the sky going from black to the dark blue that preceded color, and the road ran straight south toward Cheyenne, and Charlotte rode with the leather case against her ribs, and thought about a man who had stopped believing in things, and then found out he hadn't stopped completely. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne opened at 8 o'clock. They arrived at 7:45, and Charlotte stood at the door until the clerk unlocked it, which he did with the expression of a man who did not enjoy people being at his door before he was fully prepared to be a public servant. His name was printed on a small placard on his desk. R. Sims. He was younger than Charlotte had expected, mid-20s, with the careful tidiness of someone who had worked hard to get a government position and was determined to keep it by doing nothing that could be criticized. "I need to file a challenge to a recorded land transfer," Charlotte said. She put the oilskin package on his counter and began unwrapping it. The record in question was filed in 1881 under the name Hayes, referencing a parcel within Sun Valley Ranch, Wyoming territory. The signature on the transfer document is a forgery. Sims looked at the documents she laid out. His face was carefully neutral. "That's a significant claim, ma'am." "Yes," she said. "It is. I have the original deed of ownership, the survey records in my father's hand, a comparison document showing the signature discrepancy, and correspondence from a former Pinkerton contractor who identified the fraudulent filing as part of a broader land fraud investigation." She placed each item on the counter as she named it. "I also have a notarization date on the transfer document that postdates the notary's certification by 6 months. His certification had expired when this document was supposedly notarized." Sims picked up the transfer document. He looked at it. He set it down. He picked it up again. "The notary discrepancy," Walker said from behind her. "Third line from the bottom on the right margin. You'll see the certification number. Cross-reference that against the Territorial Notary Registry." Sims looked at Walker, then at Charlotte, then at the document again. "This will require review," he said. "I understand that," Charlotte said. "I'm asking you to file the challenge and issue a suspension of the recorded transfer pending review. That's a standard procedure under Territorial Land Code Section 14. I'm not asking you to determine the outcome. I'm asking you to follow the procedure." Sims set the document down. He was thinking. She could see him thinking, and she could see the specific quality of his thinking. The calculation of a young man in a government position, weighing the cost of doing the procedurally correct thing against the cost of doing the politically comfortable thing. "Miss Hayes," he said. "The party who filed the original transfer, Victor Hayes," she said. "My father's brother, the largest depositor at the Millstone Savings Bank and the owner of Hayes Cattle Transport." "Yes, I know who he is." Something shifted in Sims's face. A young man who had been calculating and had just found that the calculation was harder than he'd thought. "The standard procedure," Charlotte said again. "Section 14. Sims picked up his pen. He began to write. Charlotte stood at that counter and did not let herself react. She kept her hands flat on the wood and her face composed and her breathing even, while R. Sims, territorial land clerk, wrote out the suspension notice in his careful government hand. When he finished, he stamped it, dated it, and handed her a copy. "The suspension is effective immediately," he said. "Any legal action based on the contested record is stayed pending review. You'll receive notice of the review hearing by post." She took the copy. She folded it. She put it inside her coat next to the leather case. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. Walker fell into step beside her. They were 2 storefronts down the boardwalk before she stopped walking and stood still for a moment, with her hand against the wall of the building beside her. "You all right?" Walker said. "Give me a moment," she said. I gave her the moment. He stood beside her and didn't speak, and didn't look at her in the way of a man checking to see if she was about to fall apart. Just stood there, while she breathed and let the thing that had been coiled tightly in her chest since she picked up that forged document in his room 2 days ago slowly begin to loosen. Her father's land was protected, for now. It was not one, not even close to one, but the ground had stopped moving under her feet, and that was enough to breathe around. "One more stop," Walker said. She looked at him. "Victor's lawyer filed yesterday," he said. "I got word from the courier contact this morning before we left. He filed his claim at 8 o'clock last night with a night session filing." Charlotte stared at him. "He already filed?" "Yes." That means your suspension and his claim are now both in the system at the same time. The suspension was filed first this morning, which legally takes precedence." He paused. "But his lawyer is going to contest the precedence. He's going to argue the claim was filed before the suspension." "Was it? The claim was filed last night. The suspension was filed this morning." His voice was steady. "Time of filing is clear. Your suspension takes precedence. But his lawyer is good, and he will find every procedural angle available. So we need to be in front of a judge," she said. "We need a hearing date, fast." She straightened up. "Where's the federal courthouse?" 4 blocks north." She was already moving. The federal clerk was older and less easy to read than Sims, a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and the disposition of someone who had processed enough paper to be unimpressed by urgency. Her name was Mrs. Caldwell, and she listened to Charlotte's request for an expedited hearing with the measured attention of a person who had heard many requests and granted a fraction of them. Expedited hearings require demonstrated urgency, Mrs. Caldwell said. Specifically evidence that delay would result in irreparable harm. I have a banknote due in 18 days on property whose value is contingent on water access rights that are currently subject to a fraudulent claim, Charlotte said. If the fraudulent claim is not resolved before the note comes due, the bank will foreclose on property that is legally mine, under a deed that predates the fraudulent transfer by 12 years. That is irreparable harm. Mrs. Caldwell looked at her, then at the papers Charlotte had placed on her counter, then at Walker briefly. The claimant filed last night, Charlotte continued. His lawyer will move to dismiss my suspension before the standard review process can complete. I need a hearing before that motion can be filed. Once the motion to dismiss is in the system, the timeline extends to months. I don't have months. You have 18 days, Mrs. Caldwell said. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Caldwell picked up the suspension notice. She read it. She set it down. She picked up the original forged transfer document that Charlotte had placed beside it. She looked at the notarization line. The notary certification expired 6 months before this date, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Caldwell put the document down. She opened a large ledger on her desk, the court scheduling book, and ran her finger down the page with the focused attention of a woman who was very good at her job. Judge Harlan has a docket opening 9 days from today, she said. That's the earliest I can give you. 9 days. Take it, Charlotte said. Mrs. Caldwell wrote it in. She wrote Charlotte's name. She wrote the case reference. She looked up. You'll need a lawyer, she said. A good one. Victor Hayes will have the best available, and the hearing will be procedurally complex. I know, Charlotte said. Thank you. She walked out of the federal courthouse into the full heat of the Cheyenne afternoon, and stood on the steps and felt the weight of what was ahead settle onto her shoulders, not heavy in the crushing way, but heavy in the way of a thing that was real and present and had to be carried. 9 days to a hearing. 18 days until the banknote. She had 9 days to find a lawyer, prepare a case, drive 29 cattle to market, and pay a $3,000 note. Walker came to stand beside her on the steps. The cattle drive has to start tomorrow, she said. We ride back tonight, start the drive at first light. That's a hard ride, he said. Yes. She looked at the street. Do you know a lawyer in Cheyenne? I was quiet for a moment. There's a woman named Pratt, Margaret Pratt. She was a legal clerk for 10 years before they passed the bar in this territory. She takes cases other lawyers won't touch. He paused. She worked on 2 of the Pinkerton land fraud cases I was involved with. She's good. Can you reach her today? I can try. Try, Charlotte said. She sat on the courthouse steps while Walker went to find Margaret Pratt, and she took out the scheduling notice and read it and folded it and put it in the leather case with everything else, and she thought about 9 days and 18 days and 29 cattle, and the look on her father's face the last time she had seen him alive, standing at the gate, watching her ride out. One hand raised, squinting into the morning light. She was going to finish this for him, whatever it cost. Margaret Pratt was a small, compact woman in her 40s, with sharp dark eyes and the manner of someone who had spent years in rooms where she was not supposed to be the smartest person and had quietly been the smartest person anyway. She met them in her office above a dry goods store on the main street, listened to Charlotte for 12 minutes without interruption, read the documents in the order. Charlotte presented them, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling in the specific way of a person doing rapid calculation. The notary discrepancy is your strongest evidence, she said. It's objective. Dates don't lie the way witnesses do. She set the document down. The forgery itself is harder. Handwriting comparison is subjective, and Victor's lawyer will bring in his own expert. But the notary issue alone is enough to get the transfer voided if we can establish it clearly before the judge. Can we? Charlotte said. I'll need to pull the territorial notary registry records tonight. If the certification lapse is documented there, which it will be, those records are meticulous, then yes. She looked at Charlotte directly. I should tell you that I know who Victor Hayes is. I should also tell you that knowing who he is doesn't change what I'm willing to do here. I take cases on their merits. What's your fee? Charlotte said. Pratt named a number. Charlotte did not flinch because she had been practicing not flinching at numbers since she was old enough to understand what they meant. I can pay half now and half after the hearing, she said. That'll do, Pratt said. She picked up a pen. I'll have a preliminary brief ready before the hearing date. You'll need to be in Cheyenne the morning of the 9th day. Plan to arrive the night before. Charlotte stood. Pratt looked at Walker. You're prepared to testify, Pratt said. Walker said yes. About the scouting work, about what you found, about what you reported and to whom. Yes. Pratt looked at him steadily. That testimony will damage you. Victor Hayes has friends in this territory and beyond. Your name will be associated with the fraud investigation. People will ask why you waited. I know, Walker said. People will suggest you were complicit. I know. And you're still prepared to testify. Yes, he said, for the third time, without hesitation, without qualification. Pratt held his gaze for another moment, then nodded once and made a note. I'll see you both in 9 days. They rode out of Cheyenne as the sun was beginning its descent, and the air was still hot and carrying the dust of the road. Charlotte rode with the leather case against her ribs, and the hearing notice folded inside it, and the number 9 moving in her mind like a pulse. They didn't speak for a long time. The road north unrolled ahead of them, and the horses moved steadily, and Charlotte thought about Walker saying yes 3 times to questions that had laid out clearly what saying yes was going to cost him. You didn't have to agree to testify, she said. Yes, I did, he said. Why? He looked at the road ahead. Because the truth about what Victor Hayes has been doing to this valley needs to be said out loud in a room where it counts. And I'm the person who can say it. That's not a choice. That's just what comes next. She looked at him for a long moment. The scar at his temple. The steady hands on the reins. The man who had stopped believing in things and then found out he hadn't. She turned back to the road. We need to make 15 miles before dark, she said. We'll make it, he said. They were 4 miles north of Cheyenne when the riders came out of the draw. 3 of them moving fast, cutting across the road from the east in a way that was not accidental. Charlotte's hand went to the rifle scabbard on her saddle before she had finished processing what she was seeing, and Walker had already shifted his horse sideways to put himself between her and the oncoming riders in the particular practiced way of a man who had done this before. The 3 riders pulled up 20 feet away. Hard-looking men, trail-worn, the kind of faces that had learned not to show what they were thinking, because what they were thinking was usually better kept private. The one in front said, Miss Hayes. I don't know you, Charlotte said. No, ma'am, but we know you. Mr. Hayes sends his regards. He smiled in the way that was not a smile. He also sends a message. He says the hearing in Cheyenne is going to go a certain way, regardless of what papers you filed today. He says you've already spent more than you have on a lawyer you can't afford. He says the banknote is going to come due, and the cattle drive isn't going to cover it, and by the time the court finishes, the ranch will be gone anyway. He paused. He says there's still an offer on the table. $4,500. He says take it tonight, save yourself the 9 days, and go build a life somewhere that isn't already broken. Charlotte looked at the man. She looked at the 3 of them, the way they were positioned, spread slightly, not quite blocking the road, but close enough that passing was a statement rather than a movement. Victor sent 3 men to deliver a business offer, she said. Yes, ma'am. A man who was confident in his legal position wouldn't need to send 3 men to a road outside of Cheyenne to deliver a business offer, she said. He'd wait for the court. The man's smile thinned. Tell my uncle, Charlotte said, that the answer is the same as it was at my father's grave, and that if he sends men to speak to me on a road again, I will be speaking to the federal marshal's office the same morning. Walker's hand was at his holster. Not drawn just there. Present. The 3 men looked at him and made the kind of calculation that men in their profession made quickly and accurately. The lead man looked at Charlotte one more moment. Then he turned his horse, and the three of them rode back into the draw, the way they had come. Charlotte kept her eyes on the place they had disappeared until she was certain they were not coming back. Then she let out a breath that she had been holding somewhere below the level of conscious decision, and turned to find Walker watching her. "You all right?" he said. "He's scared," she said. "Victor sent those men because he's scared of the hearing." "Yes," Walker said. "That means the evidence is good enough to scare him." She picked up her reins. "That means we have a real chance." She kicked her horse forward, and they rode north through the dying afternoon, and Charlotte thought about Victor Hayes sitting somewhere comfortable and afraid, and she thought about her father's forged signature, and she thought about 9 days and what she was going to do with every single one of them. She was not done, not even close. They reached the ranch at midnight. Merritt was awake. She had known he would be, because Merritt had never in 30 years of working this land been asleep when there was something to wait for. He came out of the barn with a lantern and looked at their faces and read what he needed to read without them having to say much. "Cattle are ready to move," he said. "Daniel and I spent the day cutting them out. 29 head good condition fed and watered. We start the drive at 4, Charlotte said. 5 days to Cheyenne. We get there, sell the herd, pay the note, and I'm back in that courthouse on the 9th day. Merritt looked at her. "That's a hard 5 days. "Everything lately is a hard 5 days, she said. She went inside. She sat at the desk and wrote a letter to Margaret Pratt, confirming her appearance at the hearing, a letter to Hargrove at the bank, confirming her intent to pay before the note date, and a letter to no one in particular that was actually a letter to her father that she would never send because she needed somewhere to put the weight of what she was carrying, and the only person she had ever given that weight to was gone. She wrote, "I found this door you were looking for. I'm going through it. Don't worry about the ranch." She folded it and put it in the desk drawer. Then she went to bed and slept for 3 hours, which was all the time she had. At 4 in the morning, under a sky that was still full of stars, Charlotte Hayes opened the gate of Sun Valley Ranch and began to move her cattle south. The drive had started, and somewhere behind her, the ranch stood in the dark, still standing still, hers held in place by a piece of paper filed that morning in a government office by a woman who was not done fighting, and a man who had decided that paying what he owed meant saying the truth out loud in a room where it counted. 9 days. She rode forward into the dark and did not look back. The cattle drive took 4 days and 3 nights and cost Charlotte something she could not put a name to until it was over. Not the physical cost she had expected, that the saddle soreness and the dust in her teeth, and the particular exhaustion of sleeping 4 hours at a stretch on ground that had not softened any since the drought started. She had grown up doing hard physical work, and her body knew how to carry it. What she had not expected was the emotional weight of moving 29 animals across dry Wyoming country, with the full knowledge that these cattle, her father's cattle bred from stock he had spent 15 years building, were being sold, not because she wanted to sell them, but because she had no other choice. Each one had a number in the ledger. Each number had a history. Her father had known their bloodlines the way some men knew their neighbors' names. She did not let herself think about it during the drive. She thought about it now on the 4th morning, with Cheyenne visible in the distance and the herd moving steadily, and Walker riding point, while Daniel and Merritt kept the flanks, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 5 minutes, and then she put it away. She had a hearing in 5 days. The drive reached the Cheyenne stockyards by mid-afternoon. The buyer was a heavy-set man named Osgood, who chewed tobacco and spoke in short declarative sentences, and had the eyes of someone who priced livestock the way a banker priced collateral, accurately and without sentiment. He walked the herd. He checked teeth and hooves. He stood back and looked at them collectively. He named a price. Charlotte named a higher one. They went back and forth 3 times, which was the number of times her father had taught her to expect, and when they settled on a number, it was close enough to what she needed that the arithmetic worked barely, but it worked. She took the payment in a bank draft. She walked to the Cheyenne branch of the Millstone Bank's correspondent institution and deposited it directly against the note, which generated a receipt that she folded and placed in the leather case with everything else. The note was paid. $3,200 settled, 14 days before the original due date, and 4 days before the accelerated deadline Hargrove had set. She stood at the bank counter and held the receipt and felt the specific relief of a debt cleared, not triumph, not yet, but the solid particular sensation of one weight lifting while others remained. The ranch was not yet safe. The hearing was in 5 days. Victor's lawyer was somewhere in this city, preparing to argue in a courtroom, and Charlotte did not yet know what cards were still in his hand. But the banknote was gone. One thing at a time. Her father had taught her that too. Walker was waiting outside the bank. He read her face when she came out. "Done," she said. He nodded once. Something in him settled. She could see it, a small release in the set of his shoulders. She had noticed over the 5 days of the drive that he watched her, the way a person watched something they were invested in, without having been given permission to be invested carefully, and from a slight distance, and she had not addressed it because the drive required her full attention, and because she was not yet sure what she thought about it. "Pratt wants to meet tonight," he said. "She's been preparing the brief. She has something she wants to show us." "When?" 7 o'clock. Her office. Charlotte looked at the sky. 4 hours. "I need a bath and a meal first." "There's a boarding house on Cary Avenue," he said. "Clean rooms, good food." She looked at him. "You know Cheyenne well." "I spent 8 months here after I left the Pinkertons," he said, "learning what to do with myself." She wanted to ask what he had decided. She filed the question for another time and followed him toward Cary Avenue. Margaret Pratt's office at 7 o'clock had the charged quality of a room where important work had been happening. Papers covered every surface in the organized chaos of a mind that worked faster than filing systems could keep up with. Pratt herself was at her desk and looked up when they came in with the expression of someone who had been waiting and had things to say. "Sit down," she said. They sat. "The notary discrepancy is fully documented," Pratt said. "I pulled the territorial registry yesterday. The notary's certification lapsed March 14, 1881. The transfer document is dated September 2, 1881. 6 months after his certification expired, his seal appears on a document that required active certification." She set the registry page on the desk. "That alone voids the transfer. A notary acting outside their certification period has no legal authority to authenticate. The document is invalid on its face." Charlotte felt the thing in her chest ease another degree. "That's what wins the case." "That's what should win the case," Pratt said. "There's a difference." She paused. "Victor's lawyer is a man named Aldrich. I know him. He's very good, and he's going to argue 3 things. First, that the notary discrepancy is a clerical error rather than fraud. Second, that your father was aware of the transfer and agreed to it informally, even if the documentation was imperfect. Third." She stopped. "Third what?" Charlotte said. Pratt looked at her steadily. "Third, that your primary witness has a compromised credibility because of his prior work for the defendant." The room was quiet. Walker said, "I expected that." "Expecting it and being ready for it are different things," Pratt said. "Aldrich will put your entire 4 months of scouting work in front of the judge. He will argue that you identified the spring and the water access for Victor Hayes, and that your testimony is motivated by a personal interest in the property, specifically your stated desire to purchase Sun Valley Ranch." Charlotte looked at Walker. He was looking at Pratt with the steady, unreactive expression she had come to recognize as the face he wore when something was exactly as hard as he had known it would be. "He still needs to testify," Charlotte said. "Yes," Pratt said. "His testimony about the scouting work is the only evidence that establishes intent. The notary issue proves the document is invalid. Walker's testimony proves the document was created as part of a deliberate scheme. Without intent, Aldrich argues fraud is improvable and pushes for the clerical error interpretation." "Which a sympathetic judge might accept," Charlotte said. "Which a sympathetic judge might accept," Pratt agreed. She looked at Walker. "Can you hold up under cross-examination from a lawyer who is going to spend 30 minutes making you look like a man with a personal interest in the outcome?" "Yes," Walker said. "He's going to be thorough." "I know. He's going to ask about Anna," Walker said before Pratt could say it. Both women looked at him. Aldrich does his research. He's going to ask about why I left the sheriff's work, which leads to Anna, which leads to a man who lost someone and went looking for something to do with his anger. He looked at his hands on the table. He's going to try to make the story about that. About a man with a grudge looking for a place to put it. The room was very quiet. Charlotte said, "Is that what this is?" Walker looked at her. Directly. The kind of look that didn't come easily to him, and she understood cost him something. "No," he said. "I had a grudge once. It burned through in the first year. What's left isn't a grudge. It's just knowing what's right and doing it or not doing it. And I know which one I can live with." Charlotte held his gaze for a long moment. "Then say exactly that," she said. "On the stand. Say exactly that." He nodded. Pratt looked between them and made a small note and said nothing about what she had just witnessed, which Charlotte appreciated. "There's one more thing," Pratt said. She opened a folder. "I received a communication this afternoon from Aldrich's office. Victor Hayes is amending his legal position." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "Amending how?" "He's withdrawing the claim to the 40 acres. Pratt set the document on the table. "He's instead filing a claim to the entire ranch. He's arguing that the original deed of ownership is invalid because your father purchased the land in 1869, using funds that Victor claims were partnership capital from a joint business venture between the two brothers, a venture that was never formally dissolved." She paused. "He's claiming he is a 50% owner of Sun Valley Ranch by right of undissolved partnership." Charlotte stared at the document. "That's not true," she said. "There was no partnership." "Do you have documentation proving there was no partnership?" she thought. Her father's records. The ledger going back to 1869. The deed. My father bought the land alone. It's in his deed, his name only. A deed in one name doesn't preclude an informal partnership claim. Aldrich will argue the partnership existed in practice even without formal documentation." Pratt looked at her. "This changes the hearing significantly. We're no longer fighting a fraudulent transfer of 40 acres. We're fighting a claim to the entire property." The entire property. Charlotte sat with that for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of allowing herself to fully understand what Victor had done. Not just the fraud, not just the patience, but the specific calculated cruelty of waiting until she was 4 days from the hearing, until she had already spent money on a lawyer and driven her cattle to market and filed the challenge and done everything right, and then changing the shape of the attack entirely. He had been saving this. He had always had this. "Can we fight it?" she said. "Yes," Pratt said. "But I need everything your father had from 1869. Every document, every letter, any evidence that shows him operating the ranch as a sole owner, tax record supplier agreements, anything in his name alone." She looked at Charlotte. "And I need it in 4 days." Charlotte stood up. "We ride back to the ranch tonight." Walker stood with her. "There's one more thing," Pratt said. They both stopped. "There's a man, retired county clerk. Name is Whitfield. He processed the original fraudulent transfer filing in 1881. He's been in Cheyenne for the past 2 years." She paused carefully. "I have reason to believe he signed the filing under duress. If he's willing to testify about the circumstances of the filing." "That's a direct witness to the fraud," Charlotte said. "Yes, but he's been silent for 6 years. He'll need a reason to stop being silent." "Can you find him?" Charlotte said. "I already have," Pratt said. "He won't talk to me. He doesn't know me. He might talk to someone who can explain what's at stake clearly." She looked at Charlotte. "He might talk to you." Charlotte looked at Walker. Walker looked at Charlotte. "Address," Charlotte said. Whitfield lived in a rented room above a laundry on the south edge of Cheyenne. He was in his 60s, thin, with the permanent tired look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped noticing it only because he had gotten used to the weight. He opened the door, looked at Charlotte, and started to close it. She put her hand on the frame. "My name is Charlotte Hayes," she said. "James Hayes's daughter. You filed a fraudulent land transfer against my father's property in September of 1881. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you that I have a hearing in 4 days, and a lawyer who can use your testimony to void that transfer and expose Victor Hayes in a federal courtroom. And I'm here to ask you to help me." Whitfield looked at her hand on the doorframe. He looked at her face. "I can't," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had said those 2 words so many times they had worn grooves. "You signed a document with an expired certification," Charlotte said. "You knew it was expired. Victor Hayes asked you to sign it anyway, and you did. I don't know what he threatened you with, and I'm not asking. What I'm asking is whether you are willing to let him keep using what he did to you to keep doing the same thing to other people." Whitfield's hand tightened on the door. "My daughter," he said. Then he stopped. "What about her?" Charlotte said more quietly. "Victor Hayes gave her husband a job 3 years ago when they had nothing." He looked at the floor. "He said if I ever said anything about the filing, the job went away. They have 3 children." Charlotte stood in the doorway of this man's rented room and understood the full architecture of what Victor Hayes built. Not just land fraud, not just forged documents, but a network of obligation and threat and dependency that he maintained with the patience of a man who understood that people were the most useful material available and the most durable when properly managed. "Your daughter's husband works for Hayes Transport," she said. "Yes. Victor Hayes is going to lose this case," Charlotte said. She said it with the specific flat certainty of someone stating a fact about the physical world. "The notary evidence alone voids the transfer. My lawyer is thorough, and the federal judge is clean. Victor is going to lose. And when he loses, Hayes Transport's fraudulent land acquisition scheme becomes part of the public record of a federal proceeding. What happens to the men who work for him after that depends on what the investigation finds." Whitfield looked up. "Your daughter's husband is safer employed by a company that isn't under federal investigation than by one that is," Charlotte said. "And you've been carrying this for 6 years. I can see it on you." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to be done carrying it." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What time is the hearing?" They rode back to the ranch that night, and Charlotte went straight to the desk and pulled every document her father had kept since 1869, and spread them across the floor and went through them by lantern light, while Walker sat across from her and handed her items as she called for them, and Merritt made coffee in the kitchen without being asked. The records were there. All of them. Tax filings in her father's name alone, going back to the first year of ownership. Supplier agreements signed solely by James Hayes. A letter from the Territorial Land Office dated 1870, confirming single-owner registration. Bank records from 1869, showing the purchase funds drawn from James Hayes's personal account, a personal account that predated any alleged partnership. At 2 in the morning, she sat back and looked at what was on the floor around her. "There was no partnership," she said. "There was never a partnership. Victor made a claim he knew couldn't be proved because he thought I wouldn't be able to prove it couldn't." "He thought you'd run out of time," Walker said. "He thought I'd run out of everything," she said. She looked at the documents, then at Walker across the spread of her father's careful records, 30 years of a man who believed that the numbers didn't lie if you kept them honestly. "He kept everything," Walker said quietly. "He always kept everything," Charlotte said. "He said the land didn't lie to you, but the paperwork could if you let it get away from you." Walker looked at her. In the lantern light, his face was open in a way it wasn't usually, the steadiness still there, but something behind it that she had been aware of for days and had been choosing not to look at directly, because looking at it directly required her to have a response ready. "Charlotte," he said, "not Miss Hayes. Charlotte," the first time he had used her name. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said. Then he stopped. "Say it," she said. "When this is over, I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you tell me to." He held her gaze. "I know that's not a simple thing to say. I know the timing is everything about the timing is wrong. But I've been watching you fight for something real for 3 weeks, and I need you to know that what I feel." He paused. "It's not gratitude, and it's not obligation, and it's not about the land. It's about you. The way you run toward the hard thing instead of away from it. The way you kept your father's ledgers because you knew the only numbers that could hurt you were the ones you refused to look at. He looked at his hands briefly, then back. "I just need you to know." The lantern flickered. Charlotte looked at this man who had mapped her valley for someone who wanted to take it, and then spent years trying to pay that back, who had fixed her fence and told her about her spring, and said yes 3 times to a lawyer, laying out what saying yes was going to cost him. "Ask me again," she said. "After the hearing." He looked at her. "Not because the answer is no," she said. "Because I need to finish this first. I need to finish it as just me. And then I want to be able to hear what you're saying without the hearing in the way." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." She nodded. She began gathering the documents from the floor. They rode back to Cheyenne the next morning. The hearing was at 10 o'clock. The federal courtroom was smaller than Charlotte had imagined, and more formal, the kind of room that imposed its own weight on the people inside it. Judge Harlan was a man in his 60s with white hair and the composed attention of someone who had heard a great many things in this room and had learned not to be surprised by what people were capable of. Aldrich was exactly as Pratt had described, precise, confident, dressed expensively, with the ease of a man who had won in rooms like this before. He sat beside Victor, and Victor sat at the opposing table in his good jacket, with his silver watch chain and his composed expression, and his eyes that moved over Charlotte without landing. She looked at him directly until he looked away. Pratt presented the notary evidence first. Clean, methodical, without drama. The certification date. The transfer date. The registry record. The 6-month gap. Aldrich objected twice on procedural grounds, and both times Judge Harlan overruled him with the brevity of a man who had read the brief and understood what he was looking at. Then Aldrich presented the partnership claim. How was good? He built a picture from nothing, an alleged conversation in 1868, a supposed agreement between brothers, the shared blood that implied shared investment. He had no documents, because there were no documents, because there had been no partnership. But he presented the absence of contrary evidence as evidence itself, and Charlotte watched the judge's face and could not read it. Then Pratt presented the counter-evidence. 30 years of sole owner tax records, the purchase draft, the land office confirmation. Each document placed before the judge with the same methodical precision, and Charlotte watched Aldrich's composure tighten incrementally with each one. Then Walker took the stand. Aldrich cross-examined him for 22 minutes. He was thorough. He asked about the scouting work, about the spring, about the desire to purchase the ranch, about Anna, about the Pinkertons, about motive. He built the picture of a man with a complicated history and a personal stake. And Charlotte watched Walker answer every question with the same steady directness, not performing honesty, not working hard at it, just being exactly what he was in a room that required it of him. When Aldrich asked about his desire to purchase Sun Valley Ranch, Walker said, "I made an offer in good faith when I arrived. Miss Hayes refused it. That's the end of it." When Aldrich asked about his time working for Victor Hayes, Walker said, "I did scouting work for Hayes Transport for 4 months. I stopped when I identified that the information I was gathering was being used to facilitate land fraud against Valley property owners. I have regretted those 4 months every day since." When Aldrich asked about Anna, Walker said, "My personal history has no bearing on whether the document in question bears a fraudulent notarization. I'd ask you to tell me how it does." Aldrich moved on. Then Whitfield took the stand. Victor Hayes looked at the old clerk when he walked in, and something moved across Victor's face that Charlotte watched carefully. Not surprise, because Victor Hayes was too controlled for surprise, but the specific expression of a man watching a structure he had built for years develop a crack he had not planned for. Whitfield testified for 11 minutes. He named the date he was approached. He named what he was asked to sign. He named the threat that had been made. He named the expired certification he had been told to use anyway. His voice shook twice and steadied twice, and Charlotte thought about 6 years of carrying a weight and what it felt like to finally put it down. Judge Harlan took a 30-minute recess. Charlotte sat in the hallway with Pratt on one side and Walker on the other and did not speak. She had done everything she could do. Everything that could be done had been done. What happened now was in a room she could not enter. She thought about her father at his desk looking at the ceiling. She thought, "I found every door." The bailiff came out and said the judge was ready. Judge Harlan's ruling was 15 minutes long. He voided the fraudulent transfer on the basis of invalid notarization. He rejected the partnership claim on the basis of 30 years of documented sole ownership. He referred the matter of the original fraud and the 6 years of subsequent concealment to the federal prosecutor's office for investigation. He ordered the fraudulent record expunged from the Territorial Land Registry. He said Sun Valley Ranch is the sole property of Charlotte Hayes, as it has been since 1869. Charlotte heard the words and felt them land one by one, the way solid things land with weight and permanence and the specific quality of something that would not be undone. Victor Hayes stood up from his table. His composure had not broken exactly, it had changed, rearranged into something harder and quieter. He looked at Charlotte across the courtroom, and she looked back at him, and she understood that this was not the end of Victor Hayes, that men like him reassembled and recalculated and moved forward, because they had always moved forward, and the world had always eventually accommodated them. But not here. Not this time. Not with this land. This isn't finished, Victor said. For you it is, Charlotte said. This valley is finished with you. He walked out. Pratt was shaking Charlotte's hand and saying things she heard as a general warmth without individual words. Walker was standing slightly back, giving her the moment the way he had learned to give her space without absence. She turned to him. "It's after the hearing," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted into an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the steadiness, not the careful distance, something that had been behind those things the whole time, finally allowed to be present. "Ask me what you were going to ask," she said. He said, "Come back to the ranch with me, not as a hand, not as a hired man, as someone who wants to be there." He paused. "I want to help you build what comes next, if you'll let me." Charlotte Hayes looked at Ethan Walker in a federal courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming on the 9th day since her lawyer had written a hearing date in a scheduling book, and she thought about every door she had run toward when every reasonable person had told her to stop running. She thought about her father saying the only numbers that could hurt you were the ones you refused to look at. She thought about looking at this one directly. "Sun Valley needs a foreman," she said. "Someone who knows the water." "I know the water," he said. "You'd be taking a permanent position," she said. "Not 4 months." "I know. And I run the ledgers." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. She held out her hand. He took it. Not the shake of a business agreement, though it started that way. The pressure of it lasted longer than a transaction became something else, something that both of them recognized, and neither of them rushed, standing in the quiet of a courtroom that had just given her back everything she had almost lost. "Let's go home," she said. They rode north out of Cheyenne in the late afternoon, the same road they had ridden together in the dark 10 days ago, and the country that had looked dry and threatened on the way down looked different on the way back. Not changed. The drought was still there. The work was still there. The ranch still needed everything it had always needed, but comprehensible. Manageable. The kind of hard that had a shape you could work with rather than the kind that had no edges. Merritt was waiting at the gate when they rode in. He looked at their faces and nodded once in the way of a man who had known Charlotte Hayes since before she could lift a saddle and had understood from the moment she rode toward Cheyenne that she was going to come back with the thing she went for. "Cattle are gone," he said. "Ranch is still standing." "Ranch is still standing," Charlotte agreed. She dismounted. She put her hand on the gatepost, the wood her father had cut and set and sanded smooth on a morning 30 years ago, and she felt the solidity of it under her palm, and thought about what she was going to do with what she had held on to. She was going to rebuild the herd. It would take time, and it would take every cent she had, and she was going to do it. She was going to repair the things that needed repairing, and improve the things that could be improved, and build Sun Valley Ranch into something that did not merely survive, but earned its ground every year the way her father had always intended it to. She was going to do it with her hands and her ledger, and the man who knew the water, and the old man who had wept into a handkerchief at her father's grave, and the boy named Daniel, who was good with wire. She was going to do it as the woman. Her father had spent 20 years quietly building methodically without complaint, starting from what was owed and working toward what was owned. never letting the numbers get away from her, never looking away from the ones that were hard. She opened the gate. She walked through it. Strength was not carrying every burden alone. Her father had known that. She understood it now in the full weight of its meaning. Not as a sentiment, but as a fact, as solid as surveyed land, as permanent as a deed, recorded in a courthouse and defended in a federal court, and held by the hands of a woman who had refused at every turn to let it go. She walked into Sun Valley Ranch and did not look back. This was her land. This was her life, and she had earned every inch of both.